In 1997, I was flying from Dallas, DFW, in Texas to Jacksonville, Florida. Jax. Jax. I boarded the plane. I think it was Continental, but I don't remember, really. I think it was Continental. I boarded the plane, and I noticed a guy in the very first row, the bulkhead seats. He was already sitting there. And that guy, he looked a lot like Bo Diddley, the famous guitarist. He was in the aisle seat. He was a big guy, hard to miss. The aisle was crowded. Progress down the aisle was slow as people were stopping to put their carry-on luggage in the overhead bins. The usual drill. So I got a really good look at him. And then I knew it was indeed Bo Diddley. I stepped into the space in front of him between the seat and the bulkhead. I leaned down towards him and I asked him, sotto voce, "Mr. Diddley?" He looked up, looked directly into my eyes, kind of annoyed, kind of surprised, and replied, "Yeah, that's me," in an equally low voice. "Man, I love your stuff, Mr. Diddley. I've been a fan since I first heard you on a record. You're one of the best that ever was, as far as I'm concerned," I sort of half whispered. I could see the guy in the seat next to Bo Diddley. He was listening to our conversation while pretending to not listen to our conversation. Still not looking entirely friendly, Bo Diddley replies, "You love my records, huh? Tell me which ones you like." This is said to me with a challenging stare. I respond, "Well, I don't know if they're your favorites, but my favorites are the songs you did for Checker, chess. Those beautiful raw blues numbers, stuff like Pretty Thing, and You Can't Judge a Book by Its Cover, and I'm a Man. That stuff just sends me." He leans back in his seat, his eyebrows are raised. He says, "You ain't playing around. Look at you. Man, I guess you do know something. God damn. Ain't nobody listened to that stuff for years." "Yeah," nodding my head. "Love those records." His voice and his visage softening, he looks off to the side for a second, then he looks back and locks back onto my eyes, on my face, and murmurs, "I was a young man back then. I was a world beater back then, a young buck. We had fun making those records. Hardly got a dime for 'em, and no one remembers 'em now, but we had fun playing those songs all over the place." He smiles a little smile and asks, "Do you know I got a new record out now? Not just record, it's on CD too. It's called A Man Amongst Men." I averred, "No, I didn't know that." "Well, you should check it out, man." I looked right at him. I said, "I will, definitely. And I'm sorry to intrude on your privacy, Mr. Diddley. I surely do appreciate the time you took to talk to me." He put out his hand, and I shook it. "Ain't no kind of intrusion, ain't nothing like that." You take care of yourself. I don't have a lot of fans left. I need the ones I got to stay alive. I moved sideways back into the aisle, back into line, and started slowly shuffling my way back towards the back of the plane where my seat was. A chubby white guy in a salmon-colored polo shirt behind me asked me, "Who was that black guy you were talking to?" This is when I made a terrible mistake. A mistake I still think about now sometimes, decades later. I replied in the most pedantic tone I could muster, "That's Bo Diddley, one of the proto-rock gods, along with Little Richard, Chuck Berry, et al. He is a king, a titan, a driving force of early rock and roll." Very professorial, huh? I said that because, he deserved those accolades. The man looked at me incredulously. "Who? What are you talking about? Elvis is the king of rock and roll." "Now where I come from," I said with some tiredness and irritation in my voice. At that very same moment, I turned towards the overhead bins where a tiny woman was struggling mightily to lift her carry-on up to the bin. And another guy was helping her, but he only had one end of her wheeled suitcase, and she was not doing a good job of holding up her end, literally and figuratively. And after a questioning look from me and a thank you look from her, I took over that end, and the other guy and I, together, shoved it into the crowded overhead. I took a small valise from her as well and put it there too. I turned back around to address the guy who didn't know who Bo Diddley was. I'm embarrassed to say I was eager to educate the hapless fellow, an impulse that shames me a little bit now. To my horror, all the other passengers standing and sitting within a 10-foot radius in the back of the plane were now excitedly telling the other passengers that Chuck Berry was on the plane, that he was sitting up front. I said in a loud voice to no one in particular, no, that's not Chuck Berry, that's Bo Diddley. But it was completely useless. I may as well have been shouting into the wind. The news was already rippling throughout the cabin. It was unstoppable. I don't know what happened. No telling what happened there. I don't know how this mistake was made. Maybe the guy I spoke to disregarded the name Bo Diddley because he had never heard of Bo Diddley, but he had heard of Chuck Berry, and I did say something about Chuck Berry, so that's what he rolled with. Or maybe someone next to him overheard our conversation but could only hear pieces of it and heard Chuck Berry and decided that's who we were talking about. I don't know. It's all conjecture. Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry don't look anything like each other. But this was also lost to the people on the plane. When that guy behind me had asked me who that black guy was that I was talking to, I should have just dummied up and said, just some guy I used to work with, or something like that. I should have replied in a casual, offhand way that it was no one special. But I was still a little bit sky high from talking to him, and that's not what I did. Now, DFW to Jax is a short flight, and I thank the gods above for that. Before we even left the ground, passengers were asking Chuck Berry for his autograph, asking him if he had ever played with Bill Haley or Elvis, crap like that, and telling him how much they loved My Ding-a-ling, a novelty tune Barry had a hit with in the early 70s. Oh man, I had placed one of my musical heroes in a special sort of hell. I felt like crawling into a hole and covering myself up with dirt. Now, Bo Diddley, he was known for being somewhat brusque sometimes. He could be very prickly. Part of this was the fact that this was his personality. He was a smart guy. He never suffered fools gladly. And part of it was the fact that he resented the fact that he never got the acclaim he felt he deserved as one of the great pioneers of rock and roll. The resentment over not getting his due as an early rock and roll luminary, well, can't blame him for that. This had considerable basis in fact. He was a tremendous talent who married blues to rock, and his Bo Diddley beat burst on the scene like a neutron bomb, and is still the foundation for many rock songs today. And yet, he rarely gets mentioned in the same breath with Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Bill Haley, etc. And to be frank, he is still ignored in most retellings of rock history. Bo was a proud man. This always hurt him deeply. Musicians are huge fans of Bo Diddley. The public, not so much. I knew all of this before I approached him, which is one of the reasons I was so solicitous to him, because he deserved it. He deserved to be feted, to bask in a fan's respect and admiration for his art. He was one of the greats. And now he's on a plane, unable to flee, completely captive to a bunch of people that think he's Chuck Berry and want his autograph as Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry, the guy who he knows he should be just as famous as, but he's not. Oh, man. From the conversations going on around me in the back of the plane, I gleaned that Bo Diddley started out being fairly polite to the autograph seekers, turning them away with a firm, "I'm not Chuck Berry." Then after the first few attempts, communication stopped, and he just glowered at them. About halfway through the flight, one of the flight attendants stood next to his seat and shooed people away from him for the remainder of the flight. Get this, people around me were chattering among themselves about this, saying he was rude and should be treating his fans better. And even if he wasn't Chuck Berry, whomever he was, he should be glad that somebody was at least paying attention to him, and thank everyone for being interested in him now, since he was now a has-been. None of this made any more sense at that moment than it does now as I write it, as I speak it. But this is the kind of stupid logic stupid people often use. As far as I could tell, only one guy in the section of the seats where I was in on the plane there knew who he actually was. When he told the guy next to him that the man up front was Bo Diddley, the guy he was talking to just kind of sneered and said, "Who cares? No one's ever heard of him." And that guy, like me, just was left kind of shaking his head. What a disaster. I felt like crying. I really did. Finally, we get to Jacksonville, and they take Bo Diddley off first. The beating finally stops. I have no idea if Bo Diddley ever connected the dots and figured out I was the reason he was made to suffer like that. I hope not. It was inadvertent, but the effect was the same as if I'd tried to make him completely miserable. I should have said nothing.